this book has pretty much everything, and my first question is, this club has everything. The newest club, anyway. So, specifically that the main character is an occultist and an attorney. Did you know I was coming? Because that's my day job.
You're an attorney?
I'm an attorney.
Oh, wait, you told me this.
Yes.
Love.
So I'm reading.
I'll have to talk to you about this later.
My favorite thing is I was so excited to read this, and I read it, and it's just like, he's a prosecutor. I'm like, I have some opinions about this. And so like,
I had delusions of law school grandeur, so I get to live vicariously through this.
Oh, and you do very, very well. So I think my first question is, besides that silly little joke, is about the setting in particular, because Boston is so prevalent in the setting that it feels kind of alive. And so why did you choose to have it here? And then more specifically, how did you kind of decide what to adhere to reality? Where did you veer off? Because there are so many really amazing like textural details where I'm like, oh, I've been there. Like it's just, and it's like, it's so fun when you actually do live here. And like, how did you kind of strike that balance for yourself?
That's a great question. I am a city girly. I sometimes have fantasies of going off with the lambs and the chickens and having a vegetable garden, but I just can't seem to shake the love that I have for cities and how alive I feel in them. And I am the kind of person who, like, if I spend more than like 12 hours in a new large urban area, I'm like, should I move here? Is this my new era? So all that to say, I've always, ever since I was young, been really fascinated by the way cities kind of act as these little energetic and cultural vortexes and draw people from different traditions and backgrounds and ethnic and religious groups and create something that is distinct and unique to that city. You know, Chicago feels like Chicago in the way nothing else does. Seattle is Seattle in the way nothing else is. And Boston is Boston in the way that no other city in the world is, even though it might remind you of other cities as well. And I grew up reading a lot of urban fantasy. I really loved like the John Constantine Hellblazer comics. I loved the Nightside series and the Bordertown or Borderland books. And I was always really enchanted by the idea that magic could be just like down the corner through an alleyway, as opposed to through a portal and in a land far, far away, even though there's a certain kind of wonderful magic to that as well. So I knew I really, really wanted to do an urban fantasy series. I had wanted to forever. And I actually visited Boston for the first time on my first anniversary with the person I'm now engaged to, and I loved it so much I was like, I have to move, and I did. And we ended up living in Boston for like 4 or 5 years, and we're very close now as well. But I just put so many of the things that I love about the city or that I find weird or interesting about the city into the book. Because I think if you're reading urban fantasy that is very contextual into an actual city you can visit, part of the pleasure of that reading process is encountering places that echo real places or that are real places that you may have visited already. So a lot of the backdrop of where the characters go, like certain restaurants or neighborhoods, are places you can go. And then some of the more created places, like the Beacon Hill house, is an amalgamation of a couple of houses on Beacon Hill and in different neighborhoods. Lorena's Botanica is an amalgamation of a couple botanicas that are in the city. And that was really, really fun. So I don't know, I just kind of follow my heart when it comes to what to fabricate and what to pull whole cloth.
And I think you did such a good job in really kind of, for the people who do live here, giving them so much context immediately. Like the first thing I think David mentions that like something, he lives in Fenway, and I was like, I know who this man is. I know who this man is, and I'm mad at him already. Like it's just, and then,
correct.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like, it's such a fun kind of like wink and a nod for the people who like do live here, and there's so much like that. The other experience was where Reese and Moira live in JP, and immediately you're just like, okay, cool, like I get where this divide is. I can see how like there are clear delineations here, and I thought that was so fun, and it was just a constant delight. And so I think specifically like getting into the characters, did you have, because you write these POVs so distinctly, and I'm just curious as to like, did one come to you before any of the others? Did they come as a trio? Like, how did that kind of build? And do you have a favorite? And I am asking that question knowing that it's impossible.
Yeah, I'll answer it. That's an interesting question for this book in particular, because Evocation, the entire Summoner's Circle series, is a spin-off of the first thing that I ever wrote for indie publication, which is the Odd Spirits novella, which has now been completely revamped, edited, spruced up, beautified, sensitivity read, developmental edited, and is coming out in October, pre-order. But that story specifically is this short novella that is a marriage and trouble story between two magicians with a very different practice, Reese and Moira. And it's really about how they met and fell in love, and about their marriage and their love story and the way that they learn to communicate both romantically and magically as they're trying to figure out why their house is suddenly haunted. And I needed kind of an asshole catalyst character to come in about 2/3 of the way through and just put them in a mason jar and shake them and add a lot of pressure. And I created David for that purpose. And I really enjoyed playing with this character, who is a little bit larger than life when he shows up, and he's only in it for a couple chapters, and then he pieces out and leaves Reese and Moira to try to get through the rest of the book without killing each other or dying in their haunted house. And I just couldn't stop thinking about all of them once I had finished working on that novella, because I put so much of the things that I love and that I'm fascinated by into this book, and the kind of characters and archetypes that have really enduring appeal for me as a reader and a writer. So the interesting part here was that David, who was really not supposed to do more than serve a plot function and kind of be something shiny and sexy and irritating to look at while he was on screen, I was like, there's a lot more here, and I kind of got more fascinated by him. And I would write these scenes in these chapters thinking maybe I'll do a book in the future, and I kept coming back to him. And then once I realized that this book was really his book, and it was figuring out where he fit in the world and him working through his own problems and going through his own arc in the context of Reese and Moira, who are kind of these two binary stars, these forces that break him open in really interesting ways and activate and illuminate parts of him that would not be accessible otherwise. I was like, there's the book, I've got it. So it was just a lot of playing around with characters that I couldn't stop thinking about and trying to figure out why they were so interesting to me, and applying that pressure and that friction and tension in different ways. And so to answer your question, this is going to sound like a cop-out, but it is so honest. There are 4 books in the Summoner Circle series planned. The main cast shows up in all of them. I will not take anyone you love away from you, but each book spotlights one character and goes through kind of their emotional and magical journey, usually in the context of a love story. So David was my favorite while I was writing his book, because it was all about David. It's real David hours. You have to really love someone to spend so much time with that character. And I love all of the characters a lot, but I am working on book 2 right now, which is Reese's book, so it is real Reese hours. That is my boy. I love him very much. So he's probably my favorite right now, because I have spent so much time in his internal world and figuring out what makes him tick and putting him into the little emotional pressure cooker. Oh, I love to put people in situations.
You gotta put that man in a situation.
Yes.
So it's so funny that you say that, because there's just something about the chip on his shoulder that David has, where I feel like he knows that he was an afterthought, and he's just like, I'm so mad about it the whole time. You can see his eye twitching the whole time. But I think that's such an interesting way to kind of craft character, and then I understand that who the person whose head you're in is who's your favorite. I absolutely get that. And so kind of sidestepping into the world of their magic, we have a lot of different types of magic in this book, and so there are a lot of really good both very spoken and unspoken rules about magic, and I was just very curious as to your process in coming up with those rules and deciding how you're going to weave them into the setting and into the characters in particular, and what that process was like for you.
Yeah, that is a process that I workshopped a lot in writing and revising Evocation, because Evocation took about 7 years from first draft to publication. You are here in the 7th year, the magical year, a lucky year, but I spent more time with it than I typically spend with projects, so I had a lot of time to workshop that, but I'm also still figuring that out, and the balance of what to show and what to imply or what to encourage the reader to draw conclusions about as I go. But all of the magical and religious and spiritual traditions in this series are reflections of, if not representation of, actual living magical and religious traditions that people believe in and practice. So I didn't have to do a extreme amount of magical world building. For me, what was really interesting was bringing people who had really disparate, distinct, sometimes strongly articulated magical practices or religious beliefs or philosophies into a situation and into conflict with one another. And a lot of times I found that if I put characters who had very different approaches to things, like for example, Reese and Lita, they don't have very many scenes together, but when they do, we get through a lot of like the magical shop talk and the philosophy and understanding how they see the world being supernaturally ordered. That did help a lot. But there was a lot more inside baseball in the first couple of drafts. I ended up taking out quite a bit of me just being like, this is 3 paragraphs. No, more like 3 pages of us interpreting a natal chart. Would you like to know how to summon a demon based on the records we have from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn? Of course you would. And the reader doesn't always need to know all that. They're more interested oftentimes in knowing how the magical world building supports this house I'm building of the plot and the character arcs. It's really the foundation stone, and I couldn't necessarily build that up too much, but it is really, really fun in later books, especially in Reese's book, because Reese is the scholar and he tends to think through things in a more academic and intellectualized way to give the reader more context and more details and more proper nouns and all that kind of good stuff about what's going on, and that's been really, really fun. And hopefully I've done enough emotional groundwork in book 1 that we can go off to the races in book 2 and play more inside baseball about the Goetia and about Catholicism and about all this kind of good stuff.
And I do love that Reese is Catholic. Like whether like his kind of the tension with that I think is really, really interesting, and there's a lot of like it just gives so much texture to his character almost immediately. I think there's so much stuff that you do so quickly to establish these characters. Like within their first chapters, I felt like I knew them pretty well. And I think this is a slightly to the left question about character, but I'm very curious as to how you sort of decided to portray, like, was Moira always Southern, or did that choice come in where like we have these kind of 2 flavors of kind of New England, Boston guy, right? Like you have like the more working class guy, you have the aristocratic guy, and then how did she kind of come in? Because like the way that you write someone kind of dealing with like the very specific Boston sensibility as an outsider is so specific and so on the nose, and it's just so wonderful to experience. I'm wondering where that came from, or if she was always just like that, or what that process was like.
A lot of the main trio, their core characteristics and backgrounds have been pretty much the same since day 1. I've just added a lot more detail and a lot more nuance. But for context, I did grow up in the Appalachian Mountains of Western North Carolina.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
So I do have that lived experience of that Southern woman flavor, even though I'm from all over, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I myself am like a super good cross-section of what it means to be Southern. No one is necessarily. But I wanted to celebrate that, and I also love that cities in general, and Boston in particular, are really cosmopolitan, and they draw people in, especially since it's such a big university city. People come here for school and for work, and sometimes they stay, that this group is kind of from all over. David and Reese definitely are like, they've been in Boston the longest, and Reese is born and raised in Boston, but like Nathan is from California, Kitty split her time between like Beijing and New York. I guess Anthony's from Boston as well, but there's people from all over, and Moira, of course, is from Georgia. And I think sometimes, to your point, it can be a lot more telling and a lot more interesting to have someone who is not born and raised to a certain culture or a certain city give you insight in it through their own lens of what is normative to them or what is expected or what feels strange to them. Right. So she's a wonderful addition in a lot of ways. Again, that triangle really is what balances out all the characters. I don't think any of them would be as clearly distinguished without the other 2, but she's great particularly for kind of being an audience surrogate in a little way about like what being in this city feels like, and like what kind of people you're dealing with.
Right. And I think, again, I can't be more effusive in my praise in this. I think you nail it so well of just like the different type of manners, right? Like you have like the Southern kind of manners, brushing up against like this Boston cosmopolitan sensibility that is so distinct and so well done and is delightful to read. And so I live with someone from Kentucky, and so like sometimes the way that we communicate are just so different, and it's fascinating to see on the page as well.
One of my favorite very small moments where you see that is one of the first time David reappears in Moira and Reese's house, and it's like neither of them want him there. He's kind of there to ask for a big favor. Mm-hmm. It's really uncomfortable, but they're both trying to be polite. Mm-hmm. And for Moira, she's like, I'm mad at you, and I will tell you that I'm mad at you, but yes, I made cookies, and yes, you can sit in the kitchen, and I'll give you your 20 minutes, and I'll be nice, and then you're in the car. Whereas Reese is much more like tightly polite, like Irish Catholic New Englander, like very stiff, being like, I can't tell you to go, but I don't want you to stay. And Moira's like, I'll be nice, but I'll tell him to go. And I think maybe that is a good moment where you see that as well.
Oh, it's so funny. He's just like, I'm gonna burn a hole in your forehead with my eyeballs, but I won't say anything.
Exactly.
It really is delightful. And so did you have, when you were writing these three POVs, did you have anything that sort of was a jumping off point into each POV to kind of like get you in the headspace, or were they very easily kind of slotted in your brain, or like what was that like? Because they are very distinct.
Thank you. Truly, a lot of it is practice because I have rewritten this book so many times. A lot of the rewriting was realizing that I had written something in the wrong POV, and figuring out when you're doing multi-POV which POV to use is actually a little bit more tricky than you might think. And for me at least, what works best is trial and error, and giving myself permission to start a scene and I know what needs to happen and like how the camera needs to move if we're talking about film, but changing who's holding the camera and seeing how it colors the kind of descriptions that we get. And also sometimes it's better if someone who doesn't know as much is narrating, and sometimes it's better if someone who has intimate knowledge of what's going on in the background is narrating. So I think trying it out and swapping them out so many times did solidify in practice to me kind of what they sound like and the different kinds of things they notice. But I definitely have a little kind of like cheat sheet that I reach for that I hope helps them feel a little bit more contained. Like if you will notice, for obvious reasons, Reese is the one that typically uses religious language and metaphors to talk about things. If he swears, he typically uses religious language. He also is very like intellectualizing and problem solving. His main negative emotion he goes to immediately is guilt, shame, whereas David goes immediately to more of like an externalized anger if it's a negative emotion. David has certain little like things that he says like that's not a good look a lot. He starts a lot of sentences with like yeah well or but, like just it kind of adds this kind of an edge of nastiness to some of the things that he says. And Moira does tend to really notice how people are feeling immediately and then read the room out from that. And she does have a little bit more of, I would say, maybe feminine is not fair, but she has more color in her descriptions. She notices things like colors, textures, patterns, and she notices people first, whereas Reese is going to notice a problem, and David is going to notice if people in the room are looking at him or not. That's the most important thing, is if he is the center of attention, at least in the first half of the book before he goes through some changes. So just having that little cheat sheet for myself of like, what are they going to notice first? What kind of metaphors are they going to use? And then just practicing kind of what the writing style is like does help a lot. Like David's sentences tend to be shorter and to the point, whereas Reese tends to just kind of go on and on if he's kind of on talking about something that is interesting to him. And I didn't necessarily have that sketched out, but if I felt like I was losing the thread and being like, David is sounding like Moira, this is not going to work, I would be like, okay, what does David sound like? As opposed to what would Moira say? And then if I can distinguish those things in my head, it helps me to distinguish them for the reader. So that's a little bit more technical, but hopefully it answered your question.
No, I think it definitely did, and that's a really interesting insight into, because they are very distinct, but writing through POV is very, very hard, especially when they're always interacting with each other, to not have that character bleed. And so it's interesting to see like how you delineated that. So I think this is one of, when people are talking about your work in general, so I'll just get to the point. Polyamory, thoughts?
Big fan.
So, yep.
Take it away.
Yep. That's the question.
I always joke that like sometimes I say that I'm gonna write like almost all of my stories. Yeah, all of my stories are love stories in some way. They're often romances traditionally. And sometimes I'm like, I'm gonna switch it up on them. I'm gonna do a monogamous romance, 2 people only. I'm not a one-trick pony, they'll never see it coming. And then inevitably I work on that and I create like a strong little dynamic between 2 people. And then I'm like, it would be so much more interesting if there were 1 or 2 more people to really just mess things up and cause problems. So I feel really, really lucky in that I have been encouraged and free to write love stories that have been a little bit outside of the norm and outside of what has been expected in category romance for a really, really long time. And we could talk about that at length, but one of my favorite things about Evocation is that the love story is triangular in some ways, but it is also a marriage and trouble story in a way. It's a second chance romance in a way, and it is also a really deeply, I hope, swoony and intense platonic romance as well in a way that I haven't seen a lot of times in fiction. I think sometimes we do fall in love with our friends, and that is some of the most intimate, powerful relationships of our life, and those are not necessarily the people we are going to bed with every night, but they are still just as valuable and important and life-changing to us. And there's also like a sibling reconciliation that begins in this book that's really important to me as well. So this book is really, it sounds so sappy, but it's true. It is a love letter to love in all of its forms and in all of its complexity and dynamism and unexpectedness. And I think, especially in fiction, I am attracted to this kind of like high risk, high reward, more intensity, more opportunities for pain, but more opportunities for care and compassion and intimacy as well. And they let me keep doing it, so it's great.
Thank God. We're all so grateful because it's so fun to read. Because, I mean, who doesn't want more, like, love? Like, I don't think that's cheesy at all. I think that is so well put and so poignant, and you really do see that within, like, the relationships. And I think that, especially for me, because this is something that I see less and less, is the platonic especially. And I think that that is like so well highlighted and so lovely. And so, I mean, I'm in love with all of my friends. So like, you know, it's not, and yeah, you don't get to see it on the page so much, and that really is such a shame.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So we can be even.
I will say as well, this is kind of an ethos that I bring to any love story I'm writing, which again is pretty much all the books. It's not a bad thing. I'm not going to roll my eyes. It's wonderful, and it's a gift that I get to tell these stories. I truly believe, like with the deepest conviction possible, that love, if we allow it to transform us, is the most powerful, transformative, cathartic force that we may ever encounter in our lives, whether that love is romantic or platonic or familial or blurs the lines, where the boundaries of a relationship are permeable or not. And I just never stop being fascinated by exploring all of the different increasingly messy and complex ways that love can challenge us and push us outside of our comfort zone and invite us into radical change. And there is kind of a precipice when you're encountering intimacy where you either change and you improve and you open up your hand, or you withdraw into yourself and into old patterns of behavior and you close up that hand. And I really enjoyed working with David, especially because this is a person who is adapted to everything in their life by being super closed off, incredibly self-reliant, very arrogant, leaning on things like power, money, and a family name to cover up a really deep lack of true companionship in their life. And to him, the most terrifying thing in the world is true intimacy. It's companionship in whatever form it may take. So putting a character like that into a book like this, which is so much about relationships through the lens of magic and the demon deal, was really, really fun. And I think it caused a fun friction that kind of creates sparks.
Do you have, and this is kind of broadening into your bibliography, but so do you have either flavor of kind of relationship or a dynamic that you find yourself returning to over and over that you just really, really like including, or is there one that you haven't had the opportunity to kind of dig into that you're looking forward to in the future?
Absolutely. I love any form of second chance anything. So like exes to lovers, second chance romance, a late in life, I'm divorced or widowed and I'm finding my second love of my life. Like I love those kinds of stories, stories that are love stories that have a quality of not not redemption, but I guess a second chance to them, but also sometimes I like those stories because they come with this built-in drama of there's a reason we didn't work in the first place, and you have one more shot to get this right. Have you changed enough? And I never get tired of that. So I love those kinds of stories. I love reading them. I love writing them. I do that a lot. And similarly, I love stories about couples that have been together for a really long time, married couples, older couples, couples who have been dating for a very long time, and rediscovering someone and falling back in love with them, often in a time of crisis. That's the good shit. I will never get tired of it. But I would love to write an arranged marriage. I would love to do an arranged marriage.
I would love to read
I
you
am
writing an
sick
arranged
for an arranged
marriage.
And I will not say too much about anything or make any promises, but I do hope I get to do that sometime in the future. So those are some of my absolute favorites. And then I think because of David and Lita and working with them, I want to do more sibling relationships as well, because that's something that can be so just as intense and messy and interesting and built with deep love and fidelity than a romantic relationship. And I really want to do more sibling relationships, but luckily I get to spend many more books with David and Lita, and I have designs for them, and I can't wait to put them into situations, and I think it'll be really fun. So yeah, those are some of my favorites right now, but I'm sure if you asked me in 3 years, I would have a whole new batch of favorites.
Of course. And I think I agree with you, and as someone who, the main theme of the books that I have written are specifically siblings and sisterhood, I cannot agree more. And as someone who, I walk around with older siblings tattooed on my forehead, you can very much tell that is also, even from the fleeting things we get to see of David and Lita, it is so interesting where you're just what's going on here with you guys? Because it's one of those, we're so different, but we've clearly been through some stuff together.
Yeah, they're trauma bonded.
They really, really are. But then, there was this one line where it was something that's do you have a sister? And he immediately goes, half sister. And I was like, oh God. And so it's so interesting and crunchy, and even though you don't get to see a lot of it,
crunchy. I like that.
It is. It's fun. I really like it. But so specifically, as you've been kind of crafting this series going forward, is there anything that you have had to leave behind in this book that you're not taking into the series as it goes, or are you just basically just saying you're all coming with me and we're all just going to the stars together? Was there anything that gets fully resolved here that we're not going to see again necessarily, or is it all just going to kind of keep progressing?
That's a good question. I'm going to try to answer it without spoiling anything
really
or making any promises I can't keep. But it's a good question. I would say this series, for me in particular, I love all of my books, and all of my books are expressions of what I love, and in some ways the little manifestations of my id, what is my lizard brain like, and some books are like that more than others. This one in particular is just a smoothie of all of the things I like in terms of places, archetypes, magic, tropes, those specific things that might show up on an id list get thrown in here. It's not as dark or intense or as sexual as some of my other books, which are also really gratifying to a different part of the brain. But it is so many of the things that I love that I just allowed myself to be put it all in. And if you have to take something out, okay, but I got to leave most of the things in here. I think most of the things that got left on the cutting room floor from book one are a lot of the really technical, magical, and religious information that perhaps were not totally necessary to understand what was going on, because I know that there's a lot happening emotionally in this book, and we kind of book through a bunch of different relationships and changing relationships quickly. Plus we have David's big, I'm turning 30 magical crisis. So I didn't want to overcrowd the narrative by distracting people with being I'm going to teach you a lesson, I'm going to do a religious studies lecture. But I do think some of that will be able to be preserved in Reese's book, because that is his orientation towards the world. But yeah, some of it just has to be in my notes. And then I've tried out a lot of really crazy things and crazy scenes and ships and killing people off and all kinds of things that have not existed for many, many years, but I think those were worth leaving on the cutting room floor.
For sure. And then, so I think this is going to be my last question before we open it up.
All right.
Because I've been keeping an eye on the time. speaking of kind of just getting into like the magic, like esoterica, and because the setting is so tied to this physical location, was there any specific research that you did around like Boston kind of specific Harvard like secret society, Harvard occult, or Boston occult things in the area? Because I don't know if there's a specific history, but in kind of like forming this society, was there anything that you grounded it in, or did you sort of just make this up for this area specifically, whole cloth, the society specifically?
There is certainly occult history in Boston. There's a lot of haunted locations. There are some secret society, legacy societies that either were in operation or still in operation, many of them connected to some of the larger academic institutions. And then you also have the influx of people bringing in ideas and practices from Europe in the late 1800s. That would be like 1880, 1890, right? Yeah, I'm getting my time right.
Sure.
Sure. I don't know how like hundreds versus
I don't
15th
know.
century works.
I was an English major.
But I specifically did not, me too, and here I am. I specifically did not tie like the Boston Society to the universities or to existing secret societies. I mean, the Freemasons are still around, things like that. It is more inspired by groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, like the Rosicrucians, the Lima to a certain extent. You'll get more of the Lima in the future.
Watch this space.
Watch this space for more Lima. But I specifically I wanted it to feel kind of just like a weird old boys club where we're fighting about how to spend the endowment money and who's dating who and who gets to lead the next ritual. Because a lot of times, even in these very heady, rarefied spiritual spaces where you're pursuing ecstatic knowledge of the divine and the infernal forces, it is just people beating people, which is something I find intimately fascinating and intimately charming about religion and spirituality, is we're all just humans that are using stories and symbols and rituals and signifiers to try to make sense and order our universe. And I thought it was funny that the society doesn't have a name. People are always like, what's the name? Is it a secret? And I'm like, it was a joke with myself that it's just like the Boston Society.
Right.
Like it's been here so long that everyone's just like, yeah, the Boston one, you know. You got Salem, there's Boston, like it's fine. So it's not necessarily directly tied to core pieces of Boston history, but I tried to develop it and shape it in a way that would be coherent with the cultural and magical influences in this city over time. And I believe the society in this one started in the 60s, but it's building on the foundations of things that have been here for hundreds of years.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to ask that specifically is because it does feel like it fits so much. Like if you had said like, yes, they're like this is based on like some Harvard occult, whatever, I'd be like, yeah, no, that follows. Because it does feel like it kind of has like seeped into the cracks in a way, into like your Boston. And so I just wanted, that was a little bit for me, where I was just like very curious as to like how that came about. But I think that is, I'm gonna turn it over to everyone else here and I'm gonna stop taking up time.
Hello. I'm just gonna call on people extemporaneously. You can raise your hand. Hello.
Hi. So like there's a lot of like haunted history in Boston. Do you pick places in this book based on existing like haunted or like occult places that exist in real life in Boston?
Not necessarily haunted or occult locations. A lot of the locations in the book that are like Boston locations that are like obvious homages to streets or neighborhoods that exist, or real places you can go visit. Like you can go to Tate, you can go to the Botanica in JP. Like exactly. I was just at the Tate. I was at David's Tate this morning, and it made me very, very happy. Those are more things I wanted to shout out. Is just like those little like, you know, restaurants and shops and bars and things that I love from living here and falling in love with them and exploring the neighborhoods as well.
Sure. Good question.
So across all of your books, I don't know if I'm going to phrase this well, but
Sure, you're fine.
all of your characters in the relationships have their flaws, and there's
For
some,
sure.
some of the relationships are maybe not the healthiest, but like how do you balance the flaws and kind of like the negative aspects of the characters and the relationships with like what you said, you know, love is the most important thing, and you know that's really important to the books as well. So how do you balance those two aspects?
Yeah, I think to be in love is to be vulnerable and to admit that you are full of flaws and that the person you love is full of flaws and that sometimes those things are going to cause friction and tension. So I wanted there to be an element of the realism and the messiness there, but a lot of it is just the pleasure of a soap opera. Like, if I'm gonna do a love story, if I'm gonna do magic, if I'm gonna do drama, it's gonna be larger than life, it's gonna be operatic, because that is what I really enjoy reading and listening to. I find a lot of pleasure in that, and it keeps me engaged and interested. And I find that as an artist, I have the most fun if I'm always slightly pushing the envelope and complicating issues and throwing a wrench into the story, whether that's plot or relationships or the magic system. So I get asked that question in the context of this book a lot, which is interesting to me because to me, this is like easy breezy, healthy, we're reading our communication books, we're listening to our podcasts, we're doing the work, we are in therapy, at least by the end of the book. And then something like A Dowry of Blood and Education and Malice is just like a free-for-all of intensity and desire and being bad to each other in interesting ways. And Savage Blooms is gonna be about 10 times that, so strap in. That is the, Watch the Space, that is my new series coming out from Orbit next year. But I knew that if I was going to do a book that was so grounded as an urban fantasy, like this one, I think is fantastical and supernatural and enchanting, but it does, I hope, feel really grounded and real in the real world with real things that people go through in their late 20s and their early 30s. And it has to do with, family trauma and relationships with siblings and partners and employers and friends. Then the relationships also needed to feel real and flawed. And I'm a big believer in a hard-earned love story. For me to feel satisfied with a romance, I want you to work for it because I want to see characters go through growth. And it's only through tension and through conflict often that as humans we're really allowed to grow and blossom and to love people deeper and better. So that is kind of the philosophy that I bring to things. It's just entertaining to me. I hope it's entertaining to you. And that's how I approach, the own way that I approach the way that I want to grow as a person as well.
I'm just thinking about Dracula learning about boundaries. Lol.
Make that man listen to a podcast. He probably has a podcast in a bad way.
Oh no, that man has a podcast derogatory. Like for sure. Like absolutely not. Someone had a hand over here.
Hello.
Hi, St. Gibson. Hi. You mentioned that a lot of your stories are inspired by urban fantasy, and with that in mind, I also noticed like a couple elements of magical realism. Is there a correlation between the urban fantasy elements and magical realism?
I have not probably read a lot of magical realism necessarily in the specific tradition that comes out of mostly Latin American storytelling traditions. I have read some really good ones. I feel like my favorite kinds of urban fantasy, however, do have an overlap with some things I love about magical realism, which is that the magic, I like it when the rules are a little bit blurry and you kind of learn more about how the magic functions as time goes on, but there's also a little bit of a nebulous quality, which makes it possible for kind of anything to happen at any time. And I like that sense of unpredictability and that really lived in, grounded breathing with the magic quality that I really love from some of the magical realism books that I've read, but I don't see myself as being in like a really heavy amount of conversation with that genre particularly. I'm more in conversation with like classic early aughts American, it's a werewolf in a leather jacket on a motorcycle in New York City hunting a Fey Lord. Like that is what raised me, if that makes sense. But that's a good question, thank you. Go for it.
Before you said like this came out, like you've been working this for 7 years, I was like, oh, she's released 2 books in the same year. That's awesome. But how did did you want them to come out at the same time, Malice and Evocation, or were you like just put them together, or did it just happen to work out that way that it's like, oh, we're gonna publish this book and then just work in a few months?
It happened to work out that way because the Summoner's Circle series and then the vampire books, Dowry and Education and Malice, are from 2 different publishers.
Yeah.
The short version of how this happened was that I indie published with this wonderful micro press out of the UK, Nick's Publishing, A Dowry of Blood, I believe in 2021, time has no meaning, a while ago, a skosh ago. And while I was working on this passion project that I was going to indie publish, I was revising and I was querying Evocation. So 2 very different stories, 2 very different avenues. And then around the time that I got agented for Evocation and we started sending it out to publishers, I got an offer from Orbit, who is my vampire publisher, saying could they please pick it up and reprint it and make this beautiful hardcover edition that has a much wider reach. So I got incredibly fortunate. Lightning did strike twice. It was overwhelming, but wonderful. And the best part about this is that I get to tell 2, maybe not 2 different kinds of stories, but I get to kind of reach people with a different flavor and a different storytelling voice with projects that I'm really, really passionate about. And I get to not have to wait 10 years to space them all out. But I will say in trad that's not super common, especially if you're working in the same age category or in the same genre. So sometimes authors will do doubles to a year if they have like a middle grade series they have an installment in and like an adult standalone. It's rare to do doubles of 2 concurrent series that are the same age category. I'm very fortunate, and my editorial and publicity teams are phenomenal, and they communicate and they make sure that everything is up to a T and that no one is burned out and that everything is spaced correctly. So that happened, kind of a happy accident. Hello.
Hi. I see that this one's filed under double Leo. Do you have any other quick and dirty highlights on their charts or anything of the characters? Any favorite things about it for you?
I can give you sun signs of the big 4.
I love that.
David is a Leo. Reese is a Capricorn, if you couldn't tell. I say that with love in my heart for earth signs, truly. It is not a read. Moira is a Taurus, and Lita is an Aquarius.
Isn't he like a double Leo Virgo?
He's a double Leo Capricorn.
Double Leo Capricorn. I knew there was something else in there. Dang, double Leo. I say as a Leo rising. I say with all the love in my heart. I also am a double fire sign. So I can say that.
No, he and Reese have that really dangerous rising sun synastry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Follows. This is about to get like very astrological. So
Sorry.
It's like, what about Jupiter? It's okay. Ooh.
Me and you after hours.
We'll talk about it later.
Anybody else?
Yes.
You talked about having favorite characters and how that
Yes.
works. Do you have a favorite magic system where they all work with different forms of magic?
I do not have a favorite magic system from the book. If you can't tell, I just love it all, and I just keep cramming different magic and religious traditions into the book. But I think the one that is the closest to my heart, that I am the most intimately familiar with as a practitioner, is tarot, because I did work professionally as a tarot reader for a number of years, and I've been reading for over a decade. Some of the magical practices in here are ones that I have practiced or studied, or I have been in relationship with practitioners. That's kind of the Venn diagram. But the tarot is the one that I know I am the most confident in my ability to represent it, and is the closest to my heart, because I still read for myself every day. I read for friends and family. It is really important to me and lovely. And the way that Moira approaches her business and her tarot practice is very, very similar to the way that I approached mine.
Each of the 3 main characters kind of have like the tarot card they're associated with. How did you pick those ones? And can you tell us what Lita's tarot card is?
I cannot tell you what Lita's is, because we need that good publicity power for later, but it's a good question. I do have it picked, I've known for years, and I am interested to see what people theorize it is before it is announced. I will say so far, everyone's card is Major Arcana, so that narrows it down if you're playing the guessing game. I picked them very intuitively. I often use tarot when I'm creating characters. It helps me kind of find the starting archetype I want to work with, and the starting energy and the symbols. And then from there I add more detail and more human layers and more nuance to make them feel more than just like, you know, big magician energy. But I've known these characters or these cards for a very long time, And once I started incorporating that more into the writing, and my team had the idea to incorporate it directly into the design of the book. If you haven't read this yet, at the top of everyone's chapter, it says the name of the character whose head we're in, and it has their card. So like all the Moira chapters have the High Priestess card at the front, the Reese has the Chariot, and the David chapters have the Hanged Man, who is also the cover. So yeah, I feel like it really speaks to who they are and their skills and their failings as well. The Hanged Man in particular, at least for me, where I am in my practice, where I read for it now, often speaks to a moment of frustrating spiritual and emotional stagnation that the querent cannot get out of, that is ultimately a chrysalis for transformation and growth. It also has some overtures of like a descent into the underworld, Christ on the cross, Odin descending to get the runes, and it also has kind of a rebirth element as well, but with this heavy association of you have to die spiritually to reach enlightenment. And it's also a deeply frustrating card for someone like David who wants to keep moving and keep achieving, because you just you're held in stasis and you have all these external factors applying pressure to you, but you yourself don't have a lot of access to a wider range of movement. And I felt like that really spoke to what he goes through in this book. How are we feeling? Final call?
I'm getting thumbs up, so I say thank you.
Yay!
Yeah, final call, and then we're gonna get played off. They're playing our song. Someone's gonna show up with a vaudeville hook and just be like, enough.
Where's my top
Well, let's give them a big round of applause. We're going to start now, of course, the signing line. So